Okay, well, Morgan, thank you for organizing this session and for in accommodating my need to participate virtually. Really appreciate being here, and pleasure to meet all of you virtually or hopefully at some point in person as well. A little bit about me. Kyle Bradbury, assistant research professor in electrical and computer engineering here at Duke University, and I also am the director of the Energy Data Analytics Lab at the Nicholas Institute of Energy, Environment, and Sustainability. And so the work that I do very much is at the intersection of machine learning and energy systems, and particularly a focal point of this work has been in the space of remote sensing data, and particularly satellite imagery and other forms of Earth observation data. And so, throughout this workshop, no doubt you've heard quite a bit about applications of satellite imagery and related remote sensing data and how that all connects to energy systems. This discussion is really meant to bring many of these pieces together and raise some opportunities and challenges in that space. And I see each of the challenges that I'll talk about as something of an opportunity as well. I know there have been sessions on energy system risks and management, energy demand and the built environment, electricity reliability, methane leaks, generation siting. We're going to talk a little bit about many of these areas and look for some common challenges faced across these applications in the solution space of how do we think about these questions with minimal human intervention, relying heavily on machine learning and AI solutions. So to kind of get us started, this image, which may be somewhat redundant, because it also matches the background where I'm sitting here today. This is a picture of Groton, Connecticut, and it's 60 centimeter National Agricultural Imagery Program aerial imagery. So this is from a payload on a flight. This is publicly available across the US, and there's actually a surprising amount that we can learn from Earth observation data about energy systems. So, and I actually love this picture of Groton because it shows so many of them. So up in the upper left here, we see a very sizable solar farm. We can identify solar farms even in fairly low resolution imagery because of the size and distinct characteristics. And with higher resolution imagery can get pretty good estimates of the amount of solar that's installed in those farms. Here we can also see, zooming in on a residential community in the area, we have the number of buildings that we can see here. We can see buildings, the size of those buildings, potentially estimate the energy that can be consumed by those buildings. We can also see solar panels that are situated on them, looking differently on different buildings, if it's in the sun or reflecting back from it or not. But we can see those actually quite clearly. Over here on the right, you can see this transmission corridor. And if we zoom in very closely on there, we can even see, if you look very carefully right here, you can see the pylons on which those lines sit themselves, the lines extending north and south, and the shadow of the pylon behind it. Bit faint, but it is visible in this imagery data. Just to the right over here, we can even see a substation, nodes connecting together our electricity system and redistributing it, stepping it down or stepping it up from high to low voltage and vice versa. And something we may not often think about with regards to directly related to the energy infrastructure itself. If we look down on this road over here, we can even see some degree of traffic patterns, cars on the road, a sense of transportation energy. There's so much rich information that's present in Earth observation data if we only have the means to capture that information. And that's a main focus of the work that I do, and a topic that we'll be talking about today here. For my own lab, one of our main research visions is to enable global automated assessment of energy infrastructure in order to develop pathways to sustainably meet energy needs. And so this comes in a number of different forms, looking at supply, small-scale generation, large-scale generation, where to site it, what to, how to analyze the amount of and estimate the amount of energy that it will generate, transmission and distribution. This is often particularly relevant when looking at supporting operations and maintenance activities in this space, vegetation encroachment, planning the build out of power systems in developing countries. All of this is highly relevant here. On the demand side, we can get potentially high resolution estimates of building level energy consumption for improved load forecasting and demand response, and even from lights at night imagery and other forms of Earth observation data, identifying those areas in the US and around the world that may not have equitable access to electricity, reliable electricity or affordable electricity, and can enable some increased understanding of electrification and socioeconomic status of these communities. We even can get from a combination of 1 and 4 a sense of reliability potentially from some of these if we know some of the details of the systems that are involved here. So quite a bit of rich information here. And these are 4 areas that my own group has worked on substantially. Just to give one example related to this first small-scale solar PV generation, for a number of years back, we had worked in the space of how do we estimate solar generation, solar capacity, and then use that to find generation using Earth observation data and machine learning. Well, we can take some input satellite imagery, detect solar arrays, estimate the power capacity because the area of that array is proportional to the amount of power capacity of that solar panel. Combine that with regional insolation data telling us how much sunlight actually hits the Earth at the point of that solar panel, and use that to estimate the energy generated by that resource. And so we can get high resolution estimates of solar energy. And our group has done quite a bit of work in the space trying to put this into action. And you can go to this website. This is a snapshot from it of a map showing examples of these algorithms in action with all of their warts, all of their successes, all of the above there. And each of these red polygons is an area that the algorithm thought there was solar PV, which you can see in many of these cases is pretty spot on, but certainly not everywhere. It's not a perfect science. And part of that is what we want to talk about today, specifically around what are some of those challenges to scaling some of these techniques up, to implementing these, and where's the state of the art in the field in that respect. So collaborators that I work with and myself recently completed a systematic review of research related to machine learning and remote sensing data for energy applications. So we considered over 4,000 studies, and 185 of those studies met our exclusion criteria. They fell into the categories that were appropriate here. And this study went through mid-2020. We did not include emissions and climate-focused studies specifically in this because that's a whole another review in and of itself. And this was a collaboration with NREL as well as the World Resources Institute. So what we found from that is, first of all, energy research using machine learning and remote sensing data is very much on the rise, and mainly is using and relying on deep learning techniques, very much those that have been enabled by technologies like graphic processing units for the last few years. So we see the number of papers skyrocketing in the last few years, and if we looked at this for 2020 and beyond, that trend appears to have continued. So lots of new research happening in this space. What does that really look like? So first of all, before getting into this, one of the things we found through this were there were 3 main problems that, 4 main problems that were explored in this space. First was regression. can we estimate some aspect of energy systems or their impacts using remote sensing data? Then there were three additional problems, the ones discussed here. One is scene classification. Can we take this image, this remotely sensed image, and say, is this, a residential image or something else, right? The object detection, so this takes a whole image and outputs a single label. An object detection problem in this case is a little bit different. You take an image and you say, okay, well, we've got some buildings, we've got some cars. We find a number of things within an image. And in that...
I'm in a meeting, Everton.
Do you have a question?
Sorry, missed it.
Oh, no problem. So for object detection, we're finding specific objects within an image. And then the third problem was image segmentation, taking an image and breaking it down into each of its constituent parts. Where are the pixels that belong to buildings? Where are the pixels that belong to roads, et cetera, et cetera? So each of these is a bit of a different problem, and that combined with regression were the main types of applications of remote sensing data as applied to energy systems that were encountered in this review. And so those were kind of the methodologies that were being used. Deep learning techniques applied to those problems. And there were 4 common energy application areas that these were used with regards to. One was investigating primary energy resources, another generation infrastructure, transmission infrastructure, and energy consumption and access. And we'll talk about examples of each of these 4 common energy application areas. So starting off with this primary energy resources component here, one of the areas that was quite well represented in the literature was solar energy generation estimation and forecasting. So how much solar energy was generated or could be generated in a particular region. And this typically involved taking data regarding surface reflectance, combining that to make predictions out to different time horizons. So with all of that, there were a number of data resources that were brought to bear for different prediction periods and for both the estimation and forecasting of the amount of solar that would be generated. Additionally, wind, hydro, and geothermal resources and what the potential those resources have for generating electricity. One thing we can see with wind, you can take things like synthetic aperture radar, LIDAR, which gives you a sense of height of objects in the terrain to create digital elevation maps, and microwave sensors that can help to monitor the movement of wind. For example, seeing the changes in waves to get a sense of the amount of wind passing over a body of water. So that can give you a sense of wind potential. For hydroelectricity, the precipitation, soil moisture can give a sense of water discharge and hydroelectric potential. And for geothermal, again, LIDAR, but also soil moisture and meteorological data, including near surface temperature, again, can help to provide a sense of geothermal potential for generation production. Additionally, we can look at more traditional energy resources, coal. This is an example on the top. The orange line is the outline of a mountaintop, an open top mining operation from 2017, and then we can see in 2021 the expansion of that mine's activities over the course of 4 years. And so we can see change detection in general is an area that was certainly prevalent in these studies as well. Oil and gas was another sector for which these techniques can be brought to bear, identifying the locations of wellheads, the presence of refineries, and the locations of oil tankers for global trade, and even storage tanks. Now, these are particularly interesting. You can see from the shadow cast by the height of the top of those tanks, that top will move based on the amount of oil contained within those. And so by looking at the change in those shadows, you can estimate the amount of oil contained with those tanks. Orbital Insights is a company that's done some work in this space before. So really from renewables through more conventional resources, there are many applications that were seen in this space. Another area was around generation infrastructure, electricity generation infrastructure. So we talked already about small-scale solar, and we can identify the location and size of solar arrays and then use that to estimate energy generated. You can also identify power plants, new additions of power plants, changes to power plants. As far as changes go, this is actually a power plant I had worked at a couple of summers while I was in undergrad. It's Brayton Point Station in Massachusetts, and this power plant was at one time the largest coal plant in New England. And if you look at that power plant today, it's pretty much been entirely demolished and is now being converted into an offshore wind manufacturing plant, and will be providing some port activities for supporting offshore wind operations off the coast of Massachusetts there. And because it was a power plant before, it's a perfect point of interconnection as well for the transmission lines. So, identifying power plant infrastructure was certainly something that was part of seen there, as well as things like wind turbine identification. Even though we do have some really good data resources on the presence of wind farms. Another major area of research was around risk monitoring, right? And so things like inspecting turbine blades for visible defects. Now you think about this, well, satellite imagery, you're not gonna be able to see that. No, but things like drone imagery and UAVs might be able to provide that. And in fact, for these studies, certainly did do so. Inspecting dams for surface cracks and inspecting solar for surface damage, sometimes using thermal sensors, but also for dust accumulation. Dust accumulation can reduce the amount of production by a sizable percent, even up to 25 or more percent if there is sufficient accumulation. And monitoring that can be done via Earth observation data. So lots of opportunities within the generation infrastructure side. Also many opportunities within the transmission infrastructure side. So transmission and distribution line localization is certainly one that can be done. This is an example showing some distribution utility poles and some transmission pylons. And these techniques specific, often quite relevant to in the developing country context, where you might be looking for mapping out infrastructure to determine where grid extension may be most valuable to meet communities' needs that are looking for grid connectivity. So another area is, again, here related to risk monitoring, specifically transmission line corridor risk monitoring for vegetation encroachment or any other possible hazards. And companies like Overstory are working on this with regards to vegetation management, but some really fascinating techniques that can be done here, both with lower resolution, satellite imagery and higher resolution drone imagery. Both have been explored. And then high voltage insulator monitoring and inspection. Now, this has typically been done with drone imagery, but taking a look at the insulators themselves and trying to determine which ones are at risk. And last but not least, in these four application areas, electricity consumption and access was another area of some focus. So, we often might not think of building energy consumption as being something that you can monitor from Earth observation data, but there's a lot of information you can potentially derive from there. For example, you can identify, the location and size, potentially some characteristics like the, rooftop complexity or rooftop materials, regional density, presence of swimming pools, different characteristics that might provide insights into the energy consumed by those buildings, and then scale that up to larger areas to get higher resolution estimates of energy consumption for improved demand forecasting. And then there's the area of electricity access and reliability estimation. And a lot of work has been done in this area using lights at night data. This striking example of from the Korean Peninsula, you can see South Korea here below and North Korea here above. And zooming in, you can see, because this is time series data that's available, you can see changes in the presence of the intensity of the light at night, potentially to be able to enable the measurement of reliability over these regions. So many areas in this space to explore, and that have been explored. Now, there are also many common challenges and as I see them, opportunities in this space that were explored across these areas. One is in the realm of model accuracy, trustworthiness. So oftentimes what we found is that in these studies, accuracy, and for even some of our own work for sure, we're including ours in this as well, accuracy assessments are typically overly optimistic for how well we can accomplish many of these activities, especially in those using computer vision technologies, machine learning technologies, partially because the test data sets are rarely representative of the eventual application. So if you're testing an algorithm in one part of the world, but in reality you want to apply it to another, there's no guarantee that that's going to work unless you have a sufficiently robust set of training data to learn from. And that can be very expensive, as we'll get to in a moment. So there's a lot of work being done to improve this, but it remains a challenge that the estimates we might see in the literature may not always be the same that we would see if we just took that algorithm and applied it to any point on Earth. Further testing is usually needed. Another area that's challenging here for practical applications of these techniques is something of a replication crisis in this space, access to both data and code. So 44% of the studies that we explored here, 185 in total, did not share data or did not use commonly shared data resources. So that's a pretty significant chunk. And so if there's no data shared, we can't directly reproduce the results. Also, only about 6% of these studies shared the code base. And that can be these can be very complex pipelines to get started. But once created, sharing them can greatly expedite innovation. And the last is the lack of benchmark data sets. These data sets, putting these together and creating labeled data for this can be very expensive. So sharing benchmark data sets that we can use to get a sense of exactly what the state of the art is in the field would be fantastically helpful. There are certainly some application gaps in the types of studies that were explored here. Most of the work has been around energy resources, power system infrastructure, and energy access or consumption. So there's a lot more to that in this space, of course. So plenty of opportunity for innovation. And there have been very limited studies, geographically speaking, in Africa, South America, and Oceania. There are also some specific machine learning challenges that have been faced here. One is domain adaptation, which I'll explain in just a second, but it's really a challenge to scaling up these techniques to wider areas, related to what I talked about earlier with regards to how do you make sure this technique is going to work well in other locations. The other is, this is often a rare object detection problem. There are not often tons of examples of some of these objects that we're looking for related to energy systems, because they're fairly infrequently found on the surface of the Earth. So that makes it, again, more expensive for developing data sets around that. And oftentimes we need to do some sort, or we could benefit from data fusion. We have data sources that span different times, that span different sensor modalities. So might have standard RGB, red, green, blue imagery data, but you might have other types of data, infrared data, lights at night data, other modalities that may be useful to integrate into the mix. But doing that is sometimes challenging. So just coming quickly back to that domain adaptation piece, what does that actually look like? Here's an example of satellite images at about the same resolution in 6 different locations across the globe. And you can see that these vary tremendously. So if you trained all of your techniques to work in, Tyrol, Austria, and you want to go and apply this to Paris, France, it may work, it may not. It depends on what the nature of the imagery are and how well you're able to adapt to those new locations. That's certainly a challenge. Another area is just the data collection in this space. Satellite aerial and UAV data, unmanned aerial vehicle data, often costs some money, especially if you want higher resolution imagery, right? So that's a challenge in this space for sure. And then there's the cost of data management and processing for practitioners who want to, use this or want to quickly ask a question of the data. That's not always a trivial process to do. These are things that need to be made easier so that the cost of the data management and processing, just ramping up the use of these techniques, does not have as much of a startup cost associated with it. And the last piece I'll mention with regards to this data cost piece is around, what does some of the different data sources look like? Well, when you're talking about, and here showing us some small scale solar panels, a power plant, and a set of transmission towers for 0.3 meter per pixel resolution. And this range here is generally the range of kind of proprietary or commercial data sources. And then we get to the public and freely available data sources up here. You can see what we need to understand energy systems often falls into that higher resolution category for sure. So the last piece I'll just mention here is around security, privacy, and ethical considerations. This was something that wasn't greatly addressed in many of the papers that were included, but there are certainly challenges in the space. Security around critical energy infrastructure. How do we handle that? How do you treat that when we're trying to evaluate and share data, make that available to policy and decision makers? Where's the trade-off between providing useful information to make decisions and having it be a little bit, potentially overly shared data that may lead to other problems down the road? And of course, privacy becomes a question whenever you're talking about drone-based data collection. So if that modality is being used, there's always some questions around privacy issues. And then there's ethics, questions of ethics here. In environmental equity questions arise, and the impacts of energy systems on potentially vulnerable populations. And these are, I think, opportunities for greater thought in this space for folks who are very well versed in some of these considerations, for all of us to consider who are working in this space. So, like I said, I think these are both challenges and opportunities to work on here. And I'll just quickly mention 2 somewhat exciting developments that my team has been working on with regards to how we can overcome some of the biggest obstacles, especially around scaling up these techniques. So very, very briefly, one area is self-supervised learning. So typically when we're trying to develop some of these technologies for being able to identify solar panels or transmission lines or classify insulators that are failing, you created some sort of a data set, a training data set that has labels, polygons, or telling us where the different objects of interest are in the data. And you train up a model that can specifically do building detection or solar PV detection. And you collected your data and you have that all labeled from wherever you can get the data from, right? So you might have a PV detection data set with all imagery from California and a building detection data set from 4 cities for which you just so happen to get some data from. The problem is these often don't generalize all that well, as we talked about before, right? It's hard to then apply this, to one of these other locations in the world. We're exploring some new paradigms that are really promising in self-supervised learning. What is self-supervised learning? We don't need any labels. The technology for that does not require labeled data. You just need a whole bunch of data. So we get a whole bunch of data, doesn't need any labels, and we train something that's a universal encoder that can be used for a wide range of applications. This can reduce computation requirements, help to make these techniques available to more, more analysts and the data then available to more decision and policymakers, because it's much easier to access. So this self-supervised approach is something we're very excited about, and it's been emerging in the last couple of years. You may have seen, talk about DALI or stable diffusion. These are techniques that have emerged for generating synthetic data and whatnot. And a lot of the training that goes into them is based on these self-supervised techniques. So one other possible way that we can do this is with synthetic data augmentation. So instead of saying, well, we need to be able to train everywhere, what if we just create fake training data that looks like the places we want to apply this to? So we've actually worked on this over the past few years. So we've created kind of 3-dimensional artificial cities and then created pairs of synthetic imagery in our corresponding labels, in this case for a building detection problem, using 3D modeling to do that. That can help improve techniques. Another option is to actually take real images and just put objects that we would want to find on them and use these as artificial training data. So here we put models of wind turbines on here, and we can create ground truth images of wind turbines that we can use. And we can do this for anything we can create 3D models of. And most recently, we've used some synthetic image blending. So we take just a handful of examples of real, in this case, wind turbines, stick it onto the background of a satellite image of interest, and create a blended image for which we know exactly where everything is. Again, creating synthetic data using primarily unlabeled imagery. That's kind of the main idea here. So these are some thoughts and things that I'm really compelled by in terms of how we might be able to get these techniques to scale up through self-supervised learning or synthetic data augmentation. A lot of exciting opportunities there. So with all these challenges there, I'll wrap it up and would love to take any questions that you might have. I just want to thank the folks that I collaborate with, especially Jordan Maloff, Ben Wren, Trey Gowdy, and Wayne Hu. And so, thank you so much, and very, very happy to chat with you about any of these topics here.
Thank you so much, Kyle. This is just like such a fascinating talk. We've talked a lot about at the conference about how we brought together folks with experts in satellite data, folks with expertise in energy. Kyle has it all, so can really help talk to us about that intersection that we're trying to see more and more work going on in. And obviously what he showed us is that there's quite a lot going on already. So I think we're a small enough group. Options for questions, you can put your question in the chat, or you can just unmute yourself and ask a question. But I'll kick us off with a question, then we'll see if folks have follow-ups. And I kind of want to dig more into this scalability issue that you mentioned. So we've talked about this a lot throughout the conference, not just in the applications that you were talking about, but kind of across different satellite data applications for energy. You mentioned some of the data challenges associated with sort of scaling or having training sets in the right locations. We also talked a lot about how there are scalability challenges in terms of finding partnerships. So a lot of times a decision maker who needs information that satellite data could provide, they may not have, they need these partnerships. And so that's a difficult process to scale. So can you talk a little bit about how we can overcome, some of your examples started to hint at it with your new research, but how we can overcome some of those scalability challenges, maybe both on the technical side, but also on the engagement side?
Yeah, no, great question, Morgan. And when it comes to scalability, like you mentioned, we've got the data challenges. We have the computational challenges, which come from what do you do with the data, and then there's on the partnership side, which relates to one of the challenges that I mentioned here. I think it's the trust of these techniques that, so I talk quite a bit about some of the technical challenges with scaling. So thinking about this question of trust, I think, is an interesting one, because before these techniques really start to take off and start to get actually injected into decision-making pipelines, there needs to be a consensus that, yes, this works well enough for our needs. And there's a lot of promise that's been presented. I mean, we went through hundreds of studies, right? You look through these studies, there's a ton of promise that's present in all of these studies saying, okay, yeah, these have worked well in these particular laboratory settings. How do we move from the laboratory setting to something more? Or how do we enable those working in the lab to create evidence that will be accepted by those who need to really make critical decisions based on this information? So I think there are a few ways of going about that. First of all, I mentioned this importance of benchmarking, and I actually don't think this is as much of a technical issue as I think it is a trust issue. If we have benchmarks that people can agree on, say, yeah, if you can do well here, we buy it. Your technique works. I mean, you see a lot of these grand challenges that are put forward with prize money associated with it, and then the Netflix challenge that came up a few years back, saying, okay, well, if you can do well in this problem, we know that you've made it work. I think that's a little bit of what we need in this space. Some benchmarks that people can say, yes, this is the one, and then we can keep pushing together as a community and say, okay, now we know, we get to this level of performance that meets our needs. Let's go and use this at scale. So that is, I think, one of the most important pieces. And the other, I think, is a little bit of a layer of translation. A lot of times, and I'm very much guilty of this myself, I start throwing around terminology that has meaning to me in very particular settings, but may not be what somebody who just needs the data this is based on to know, to be able to say, yes, I can trust this. So being able to translate those metrics, having agreed upon metrics that will be sufficient for the community. While these are technical components, I think they lead to very non-technical advancements for scaling.
Great points. And we have a question in the chat, which is, what is your recommendation for the resolution that is enough for energy analysis in terms of balancing the scale and computational power that's available?
Yeah. So that very much will depend on what particular type of analysis we're looking to do. So to give some ballpark senses of some of the, we were talking about small scale solar PV, right? There, you pretty much need 60 centimeter resolution data or better. And when I say better, I mean finer resolution to be able to make that work. Otherwise you have less than a pixel per solar array, and that's just not gonna be enough information to determine the presence of a solar array. Now, if you were instead interested in solar farms, I've seen some studies doing this, sentinel imagery might be fine. So 10 meter imagery may do the trick because you're looking for a much larger object, right? So I think it depends on the scale of the object. So if you know roughly the size of the phenomenon that you're looking for, you want to make sure that that every, whatever you're looking at, you get at least a half dozen to a dozen pixels within that, right? So I think that's a decent way of thinking about that. But it will vary. We recently did a study looking at, actually it was in Africa, looking at very small scale solar PV installations. These might be just enough to charge a cell phone. What do you need to make that work? None of the satellite, not even the highest resolution satellite imagery is going to work for that. You need, UAV or / drone imagery to make that work. You're talking about, on the order of, single centimeter resolution data there. So it's dependent on what the size of the phenomenon that you need to capture is going to be related to.
I'm going to ask a piggyback question off of this one too, because I think
Sure.
it's such an important topic. So can you talk a little bit about how you engage in the uncertainty communication piece? So this comes up a lot I come from this more as an energy systems modeler, new to satellite data.
Yeah.
And this comes up a lot in energy systems modeling, air quality modeling, where you have models that are designed to work well at particular scales. But as soon as you have a map, people are going to look at that map and they're going to say, where's my house? And did you capture my house right or wrong? And so how do you kind of balance both making sure you have the appropriate accuracy to answer the question that you're trying to answer, but maybe in these cases where coarser results are appropriate, how do you communicate that with decision makers?
Absolutely. So we encountered this actually quite frequently when we're talking about finding small scale solar PV arrays, right? Because just like you said, yes, did they find my solar PV array? Well, in short, that may not matter, right?
Mm-hmm.
What will matter is, did we find 99% of all of the solar PV arrays that existed? If we skipped yours, that's unfortunate, but it still may be acceptable. So there are two things. One is, I think, very clearly communicating, again, the metrics. So for example, with solar PV, you typically have two metrics, right? Or when you're trying to find specific objects, you typically have two metrics. One is, of all the actual installed solar PV systems in the area, what fraction of them did I successfully find, right? So that's that value is typically called recall. Then you can say, well, in a given area, square kilometer, how often did I just have a spurious error? Did I just say there was a solar panel when there wasn't one? So that's typically referred to as precision, and so, or is related to that, tightly to that concept. So I think if we're able to very clearly, for every analysis that goes out, have all of those metrics, almost like a cover sheet on the data set, to say, okay, all estimates are imperfect. This describes the bumps and bruises of this data set. If this is, meets your criterion, that's good. You may say, okay, well, having 99% of the solar panels is all that I need here, mm-hmm. right? And so I think that really can get at some of those challenges.
We have another question in the chat, and folks, feel free to unmute yourself or raise your hand if you'd like to ask your question verbally also. But curious if you want to take a stab at this, but are the regions that we identify as having lower solar potential then more vulnerable to targeted ads or campaigns by the fossil sector? So maybe what are you seeing as kind of some of these connections between renewable energy potential and adoption?
So there's actually, there have been some interesting studies around what the impact of saying, okay, well, if an area has a bunch of solar or no solar, what can we typically glean from that? Steve Sexton and Brian Bollinger had written about this a few years back, looking at how the presence of a solar panel on one home in a neighborhood can often be predictive of the likelihood of development of additional solar. So once you say, okay, I see my neighbor has a solar panel, oh, it must be okay. This must, there's a sense of in-group connection there. There's a sense of trust in one's neighbors potentially that comes into play. And so for solar developers, there can be a huge benefit to getting that, initial site installed, because there can be a lot of positive impacts of that in terms of the interest in development afterwards. Now, I'm not familiar with how this has been used by other industries, but clearly these data are being looked at within the solar development industry. And so, I think that it becomes a very interesting resource then for if I'm a developer going to a new region, what do I want to do? I want to go and be that company that's going to get those first few installations put down and then build it out, because then I also get the reputational effect of, it's the first one in the area and I know what companies installed it, I'm going to call them. So, I think there can be some strong benefits from that.
I have some more questions, but I'll pause for just a few seconds to make sure we're not missing.
I have a question. So thanks for the great talk. I wanted to touch on kind of the policy application side of things that you had mentioned earlier. I was just wondering, do you see any like particularly helpful applications in policy for this kind of work, like any specific policies or incentives that it could influence more than others? Or I certainly see wide applications across policy. I was just wondering if you had a take on that.
Thanks, Madeline. Really appreciate the question. I'm by no means a policy expert, but I sit around a lot of smart people who are, and I think that where one of the questions that gets brought up regularly is, I often get asked, where's the data? How can I learn about X? I regularly get requests for data from colleagues, from folks that are say, oh, are you familiar with a way of getting information about this? My takeaway from those conversations is that, well, actually, I think in the energy space, there's more data than there are in a lot of sectors. I talk to folks in the water space, and it's a whole different conversation often in that case. But there's still some really important gaps in this space that could be filled, and I think that's one of the most valuable contributions that these techniques can make, which it's filling gaps. It's filling gaps faster than we can collect data using other methodologies. So the frequency of data gathering, and the scale potentially of the data gathering, dwarfs most other approaches to getting this type of information. So I think that's where the strengths lie, potentially in connection to the policy space, even if that means that these data, again, they may be imperfect, but they're better than no data, and in many circumstances, again, not always, better than no data, and can be at least a starting point for planning and development processes, you know, as soon as these, you know, the data become available. I'm not sure if that addressed your question, but you know, I think it's certainly I would love to hear about what others' thoughts are in the policy space, where you know, having you know, participated in this workshop, where some of these areas may particularly resonate. What are the applications that particularly resonate for you? I have my, you know, my own pet areas, but that doesn't mean that those are always the ones that are going to emerge as the most important in the years ahead.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you. Yeah. And I certainly am not in the, you know, policy space either. I am, you know, pursuing my PhD and hope to do policy relevant research. And so, you know, just kind of asking those questions to see what your takes are, but I appreciate your thoughts on that. Thanks.
Thanks, Alan.
Kyle, another theme that's come up in a lot of sessions at the conference is kind of this tension with public and private data. So we talked a lot about expanding the use of satellite data in applications that support the public good, whether that's policy or other kinds of decision context. And a challenge that keeps coming up is we have a lot of, you know, we have a lot of great data from the public sector, and we have a lot of great and often higher resolution data that's coming from commercial satellites. And so do you have thoughts? This is kind of the $1 million or $1 billion question, so it's not an easy answer, but how do we kind of bridge that gap and make these data accessible for solving urgent problems of public interest, given the financials involved?
Absolutely. I have so many thoughts on that particular question, but I will spare you most of them. But it's a major challenge, right? You know, access to proprietary data, and I totally understand the perspective of you know, owners of these data. The cost of these extremely high resolution satellite constellations, I mean, is incredibly high, and there's a lot of infrastructure required to share those data, not just because of the size of the data. You know, this makes Landsat and Sentinel look tiny, right? Now, obviously, Landsat, Sentinel, incredibly useful tools, and I'm very thankful for their existence and for all those who make that happen. But you know, looking at, we have two main providers, I think, that are that hold a fortune of data. You know, Maxar, Digital Globe, the owners of Worldview, the Worldview satellite series, and Planet. You know, so, you know, 0.3 meter data versus, you know, well, 0.5 to 3 meter data, depending on the particular product. I think given that fact that, you know, these were really expensive investments that had to be made, you know, I think allowing researcher access and public access within the right institutions to allow for some preliminary analyses of these data, to allow for some development of techniques, could be mutually beneficial, especially if those techniques could be made open source, and they could then be integrated into other offerings that could be used going forward. Now, it's not an easy question, because, you know, if we look at the relative, you know, even if we did have, you know, amongst the research and policy community, the resources to purchase data around specifically to address energy questions, there's no guarantee that would still even be enough to offset many of the other private sector uses of these data to be worth the while of many of these companies. So I think Partnerships are really important for that. Trying to find win-win situations to get access to those data. Trying to provide open source products from the results of using the data that can be shared more broadly, that everyone can benefit from. I think if we all win, that's kind of the best situation in that case when it comes to what we're doing to make use of the data. But short of having one of these systems purchased by or highly invested in by a government entity to make them publicly available, I think it's going to require some compromise on both ends to really make these the most innovative developments in this space that we can.